He spoke no English. He had no official rank in the Continental Army. He had no orders from Congress. He had no authority over anyone. What he had was a letter of introduction, a small dog named Azor, and a reputation that was partly true and partly invented, because the truth about who he actually was would have gotten him sent home immediately. He arrived at Valley Forge in February of 1778. The Continental Army was dying, not metaphorically. Men were starving. Men were freezing to death in log huts that barely kept out the wind. 12,000 soldiers had arrived at Valley Forge in December. By February, thousands were too sick to stand. And the ones who could stand didn't know how to fight. Not properly. Not the way that could beat the British in an open engagement. They loaded their muskets differently depending on which colony they came from. They marched at different paces. Their officers gave commands in different words. An order issued on one end of the American line arrived completely changed by the time it reached the other. 2 years into the Revolution, the Continental Army was not an army. It was a collection of regional militias that happened to be wearing similar coats. The man who arrived in February 1778 looked at this and was not discouraged. He had spent his entire life turning bad soldiers into good ones. He had watched Frederick the Great build an army that terrified Europe. He was going to do the same thing here in 90 days. Before we go any further, if you are new here, hit subscribe. Every week on Reckoning, we cover the full history behind the wars, decisions, and people that shaped the world you live in. No fluff, no shortcuts, the complete story. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. It can be as simple as a city or a country. We genuinely want to know where this channel is reaching, and every comment helps us reach more people just like you. Now, back to Valley Forge, and the Prussian who was about to do something nobody thought was possible. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben. He told people he was a lieutenant general in the Prussian army, a direct aide to Frederick the Great, a man of impeccable military credentials. Most of this was exaggerated. Some of it was invented entirely. He had served in the Prussian army, and that much was true. He had fought in the 7 Years' War and performed well. He had been a staff officer with genuine experience of how professional armies operated at the highest level. But he had left the Prussian army as a captain, not a general. He had spent years afterward in minor positions at small German courts, never quite finding the role his ambitions demanded. By 1777, he was in his late 40s without a major command, and running low on the money and connections that sustained a man of his social position. Benjamin Franklin, who was managing American diplomacy in Paris, understood immediately what he had when von Steuben walked into his office. Not a Prussian general, but something more useful. A man with genuine professional military knowledge, European prestige, and a very strong incentive to make himself indispensable. Franklin helped him construct the credentials. He inflated the rank. He wrote the letter of introduction. There was one more secret that Franklin almost certainly knew and never wrote down. Von Steuben was likely gay in an era when that could mean imprisonment or worse. He had fled a small German court under circumstances that suggested scandal. He could not go back to Prussia. He could not stay in Europe. America was not just an opportunity, it was a necessity. A man with everything to prove and nowhere else to go arrived at Valley Forge in February of 1778. He was exactly what the Continental Army needed. The army von Steuben found at Valley Forge was not what any European military professional would recognize as an army. The problems were fundamental. Not a matter of courage. The men had proved at Bunker Hill and Trenton and Brandywine that they were willing to fight and die. The problem was everything around the fighting. The system. The organization, the shared language of command that makes a mass of armed men into a coherent force. European armies of the 18th century operated on precise drill. Every movement, loading, firing, advancing, wheeling, retreating under fire, was performed in a specific sequence of steps, commanded by specific words, executed at a specific tempo. A regiment trained to this standard could perform these movements in chaos, in darkness, in the middle of a battle. The movements became automatic. The Continental Army had no standard drill. Different regiments used different manuals. Some used British ones. Some used Prussian ones. Some had invented their own. In order to fix bayonets produced different results depending on which state the regiment was from. A command to advance in line produced men moving at different speeds, breaking the formation before it had gone 50 yards. The musket loading sequence, 15 distinct steps from cartridge to fired shot, was performed differently by almost every regiment in the army. This was not the soldiers' fault. Nobody had ever standardized it. Von Steuben looked at this and began writing. He wrote a drill manual, in French because he did not speak English. His aide translated it into English each night after von Steuben had dictated the day's work. The translation was then read to the men the following morning. He did not wait for the manual to be finished before he started training. What von Steuben did at Valley Forge was unprecedented in the Continental Army. He did not hand the drill manual to the officers and tell them to train their men. He went onto the parade ground himself. Senior European officers did not drill enlisted men. That was work for sergeants. A general who got down in the mud with enlisted soldiers and showed them personally how to hold a musket was doing something that violated every convention of 18th century military hierarchy. Von Steuben did not care about convention. He cared about results. He selected a model company of 100 men, picked from across the army for their physical condition and apparent intelligence, and he drilled them himself every morning. On the parade ground at Valley Forge in February cold, in the snow, sometimes in temperatures that made the breath freeze in the air. He demonstrated every movement himself before asking the men to do it. He showed them the correct musket grip. He showed them the loading sequence step by step. He marched with them, counted the tempo himself, corrected individual men by name. He learned enough English profanity to express his frustration when a movement was wrong. And when his English ran out, he called for his aides to translate the rest of his complaints. The men loved him for it, not because he was gentle. He was not gentle. He was demanding and completely intolerant of sloppiness, but he demanded it of himself first. He was out there in the cold with them. He treated them not as social inferiors, but as professionals being trained to do a professional job. That was new. That was something the Continental Army had not experienced. Within days, the model company could load and fire at a rate that matched British gun crews. Within a week, they could wheel in formation on command. Within 2 weeks, they could perform the bayonet drill that European infantry used to break enemy lines. Then, von Steuben sent them back to their regiments. Each man became an instructor for his own unit. The training radiated outward from the 100 men at the center. Washington watched the transformation happen and gave von Steuben more authority. More companies, more regiments, the whole army. By spring, the Continental Army that marched out of Valley Forge was not the army that had marched in. The Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778 was the proof. The British had evacuated Philadelphia and were marching across New Jersey. Washington pursued. The armies met at Monmouth Courthouse on June 28th in brutal summer heat that killed men on both sides before a shot was fired. The battle began badly, An American commander ordered a retreat without authorization when the fighting started. Washington arrived to find part of his army falling back in disorder. What happened next was different from anything the Continental Army had done before. Washington rallied the retreating troops, and the troops rallied. They stopped, they turned, they formed a line. In the middle of a battle, in brutal heat, with British regulars pressing forward, the Continental soldiers executed the movements von Steuben had drilled into them at Valley Forge. They loaded and fired in sequence. They held their formation. They met a British advance with the kind of sustained, disciplined musket fire that European armies had spent decades perfecting. The British did not break the American line. When darkness fell, the British withdrew. The battle ended as a tactical draw, but for the Continental Army, a draw against British regulars in a sustained engagement was something that looked nothing like Long Island or Brandywine. Von Steuben watched from a position near the American lines. He had never fired a shot. He had drilled the men who stopped the British advance. After Monmouth, no serious analyst questioned whether the Continental Army was a professional fighting force. Von Steuben's drill manual, written in French, translated into English night by night at Valley Forge, became the official military manual of the United States Army. It was called Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States. It standardized everything: the loading sequence, the march tempo, the commands and their words, the duties of officers and non-commissioned officers, the organization of a regiment's daily life. For the first time, every soldier in the Continental Army was doing the same thing, the same way. The manual remained the official military doctrine of the United States for 33 years. Von Steuben served the Revolution until the end. He was at Yorktown in 1781, commanding one of the 3 divisions in the final siege. He coordinated the logistics of the assault on the British redoubts on the night of October 14th. After the war, Congress gave him American citizenship. They gave him a pension, though it was inadequate and late and required years of petitioning to secure. He settled on a farm in upstate New York. He died there in 1794 at 64 years old, having found the country where he belonged. He never received the full credit the Revolution owed him. His name does not appear in most accounts of the war with the weight it deserves. But the army that won at Yorktown was trained the way it was trained because of what happened at Valley Forge in February of 1778. And what happened at Valley Forge was one Prussian man who spoke no English, had nowhere else to go, and spent 90 days in the cold showing farmers how to be soldiers. The story of von Steuben has one more dimension that history spent 2 centuries reluctant to discuss. The scandal that drove him from the small German court before coming to America was almost certainly related to accusations about his relationships with younger men. He was likely gay in an era when that was not merely socially unacceptable, but potentially criminal. He could not go home. He could not stay in Europe. America was not just an opportunity, it may have been the only place left. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. The man who built the professional army that won American independence did so in part because he had no other option. The country that claims liberty as its founding principle was, perhaps without fully knowing it, a refuge for a man whom every other society of his era would have destroyed. He gave America the army it needed to survive. America gave him the only place he could be himself. That is not a simple story, but the full history rarely is. A Prussian foreigner who spoke no English carried a secret that could have ruined him and had nothing to offer but professional military knowledge and absolute determination, arrived at Valley Forge in February of 1778. 90 days later, the Continental Army was something it had never been before. Not because the men got braver, they were already brave. Because someone finally gave them a system, a shared language of command, a standardized way of loading and firing and moving and fighting that let their courage translate into military effectiveness. Von Steuben understood something the American commanders around him had not fully grasped. You cannot build a professional army by hoping men will fight professionally. You build it by training them so thoroughly that the professional behaviors become automatic, so that the body does the right thing even when the mind is overwhelmed. He gave the Continental Army that, and the Continental Army gave him everything he did not have before he arrived. If this story stayed with you, if you learned something here you did not know before, hit subscribe. Every week on Reckoning, we cover the full history behind the wars, decisions, and people that shaped the world you live in. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. It helps more people find this channel, and we genuinely want to know where Reckoning is reaching. We will see you in the next one.